I'm actually delighted to be here with such a distinguished panel, and you should regard me as only the warm-up speaker for the experts that you're going to be hearing from. We have Ambassador de Alba, who is the UN Special Envoy on Climate Change and has a hugely important role, as I'll say in a minute, in the next few months in bringing people together. We have Professor Molina, who's been honoured by not only the British government for his great work, but also, of course, is a great Nobel Prize winner. And we have Terry from Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, and we were together in Amsterdam only a few weeks ago. So you have a very distinguished panel. I think I'm here as a British citizen to reassure you that no matter how dysfunctional you think the American political system is, nothing could compare with what's happening in Britain. I just heard as I came in that the House of Commons in Britain, the centre of our democracy, has been flooded. So we don't only have a political disaster, we have an environmental disaster in Britain as well. My theme is the global order. John Kerry talked this morning about what could happen at a national level by changes that people made in policies here in America and in other countries. We've just heard from the mayor about what cities can do. We're talking about what corporates can do. We'll hear more about the science and also about what NGOs can do. I want to talk about the global order and how we can be better prepared and better equipped for the future in dealing with what I consider to be a cross-border problem, a global public good that has to be honoured and dealt with, and where I consider, as Steve has just said, and Steve's a brilliant leader on these issues, and I have a pleasure working with him, the ungoverned spaces or undergoverned spaces in the world economy and world society, environment being one of them, where there is no rule of law in some areas, and where even when there is the rule of law, there's not proper execution of these rules. And I think when you look around biodiversity, if you look around our oceans, if you look around food issues and agricultural issues, you've got areas which are essentially ungoverned and undergoverned. And they cannot be solved by nation states on alone, and no matter what cities can do, and no matter what business can do, and what NGOs do, and that is incredibly important, we do need also to have a way of cooperating better internationally. And so my theme is rather similar to the theme that Einstein used to choose when he went around Britain after he published his latest book, The Global Order and What's Going to Happen to It. And some of you may know that late in life, Einstein was writing these books, having given up on his physics about the global order. And he used to publish his book, and he used to hire a chauffeur, and he used to travel around our country and parts of Europe. And every day he would visit about 6 towns and give a speech. And then move to the next day where he did another 6 towns, another 6. So he did about 50 meetings around the country to publicize his book. The only thing was he gave exactly the same speech wherever he went, a 15-minute speech. And one night, and Einstein was an old man, and this was before the television age, one night his chauffeur said to him, "I've been traveling with you, Mr. Einstein, for these 6 weeks. We've done dozens of meetings. I now know your speech off by heart. And you're looking tired this evening. Why don't you just let me give the speech? You sit in the audience as if you're the chauffeur, and we can get through this very quickly." And Einstein, an old man, tired, he agreed to this. So the chauffeur came up to the rostrum, gave the speech absolutely brilliantly. He'd heard it so many times he couldn't not get it right. And he sat down to great applause, and then was about to walk off the stage when suddenly the chairman said, "Are there any questions?" First question, what is the relationship between the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics? And the chauffeur is rooted to the spot, doesn't know what to say, looks down to Einstein for inspiration, gets absolutely none, and then hits on it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this question is so simple, it's so straightforward, I'm going to ask my chauffeur to come up." Now, Einstein said that the definition of insanity was doing the same thing all over again and somehow expecting different results. And I think what we heard this morning from John Kerry and what we know about the official statistics is we can't continue to do exactly the same. Business as usual will not allow us to get to the 1.5 above pre-industrial levels, not even to the 2%, but as he said this morning, and most experts are saying, we are 12 years away from catastrophe. If we do not change, it will be 3 and perhaps higher. And therefore, all the great work that has been done will lead us simply not to the result that we chose in the Paris Treaty but to going things going a lot worse. So I want to talk about how we might improve the international decision-making system so that we do get the results we want. And I don't deny the importance of city action or national action, but I think it must be complemented by the international action I'm talking about. Now, let me tell you how chaotic the system of decision-making on climate change was. I actually was the first leader that said I would go to Copenhagen, and President Obama was there, and all the leaders of the world eventually came to Copenhagen. But you know, when we arrived there, there would be delegates representing 190 countries. And they couldn't even agree on the chairman for the event. They were supposed to be the most complicated climate change treaty ever, but someone stood up and challenged the right. The Danish Prime Minister had invited everybody to Copenhagen. He had organized the conference. He rather assumed that he would be the chairman of it. And suddenly he was challenged from the floor as to whether he'd be the chairman. And then we found that 190 countries giving speeches. Every leader gave a speech. Where was that going? There was no means of compositing or getting to a resolution. It was utterly chaotic. So we formed this executive informally, and this executive was to present recommendations to the whole event. Unfortunately, the Chinese leader, Premier Wen at that time, who was there, Wen Jiabao, he refused to come to the steering committee, felt that he was going to be overruled. He sent his ambassador, and his ambassador was clearly there not to reach a constructive conclusion, but to prevent a constructive conclusion being reached. And at one point, I just recall, and it always will be in my mind, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, was saying, we want, as the advanced economies, the rich economies, we want to make a commitment that we will reduce carbon emissions in 2030 by this, in 2040 by this, 2050 by this. And the Chinese ambassador says, you can't do that. And she said, but we're the countries, we're making, all of us, all the rich countries are making this pledge to help the developing world. And he said, no, you can't do it. She said, why? And he said, because we will be one of these rich countries in 240 and 250, and we're not going to be bound by that. And at that point, the Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, almost punched physically. So it was hardly an edifying experience. And what, of course, we found out was that the Chinese delegation on this occasion, and we had totally misjudged it, all of us, the Chinese delegation had no authority to go beyond the mandate that they had. So any negotiation was not going to lead to results. And eventually President Obama went to meet Premier Wen, who hadn't come to any of the meetings, and at the hotel they met, and suddenly President Obama walked in, and I think to his great surprise, sitting there was not just the Chinese premier, but the Indian Prime Minister, the Brazilian leader, the South African leader, and the Russian leader. And they'd all ganged up as bricks to say that they were not going to have imposed on them targets that they felt would damage their economic prospects. And yes, the West may want to do something because of historic emissions, but they were not going to put their economies at risk. And so the only agreement we could get at Copenhagen was, first of all, to have nationally determined targets, of course, a degree of transparency in the reporting of it, a climate change fund, which very few people in then contributed enough to make it viable to help the poorer countries in the island states. And so we moved on to Paris. And at Paris, of course, what John Kerry said this morning is absolutely right. At Paris, what they'd managed to do beforehand was get an agreement with the Chinese. And the China-American agreement was absolutely critical. Without what John Kerry did, we could not have had a Paris agreement. But when it came to the Paris Agreement as a whole, of course, we got major advances. A global goal set, I've just talked about it, 1.5 and 2. We had nationally determined commitments, NDCs as they were called. We also had a climate change fund that was for help to the poorer countries. And we had this system of review that every 5 years we'd try and up the ambitions, and that will come very soon. And we'll rely on Commissioner and Ambassador Alba to make sure that this happens. But what, of course, we hadn't done for all the great advances of Paris, and this is the issue, nationally determined commitments does not necessarily add up to meeting the 1.5 or the 2%. And because we could not get countries to agree that they would all fit in under 1.5, and if they didn't, then they would look at it again, then we had a situation where you had nationally determined goals that pushed us towards 3% and not towards 2%. And now we have, for the first time, the emissions of the bigger economies, China and America, going up in a way that hadn't happened in 2 previous years. And in a sense, they are not fulfilling even the commitments that were made in the Paris Treaty. And just think of it, if you had a nuclear weapons treaty and you couldn't specify in that treaty the number of weapons that each country would have, and you let them just decide the numbers they wanted to have, and then you say that the end product will be how you added up the different commitments that people have made, you would not have had any nuclear security at all. So it is a real problem, and it's got to be addressed. And the question is whether it's a failing of politicians, and there's plenty ways you can say politicians have failed. One of the phrases I like about politicians is from Shelley, the poet in Britain, who said that politicians had lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. And you may feel that that is very true. And of course, Churchill, who was one of my predecessors, and remember this, that he made a resolution late in life to drop the previous one, never to drink alcohol before lunch, and he changed it to never to drink alcohol before breakfast. And he said politicians usually get things right after trying everything else, but his verdict on politicians were resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful for impotence. And so you can see that there is a lot of criticism of leaderships and what politicians do. But I think there's a structural flaw in the system that we've got to address. There's a systemic failure that needs to be addressed. How are we going to get countries to agree that they will have nationally determined targets, but also they will fit in with the global aspiration, and therefore they will, in a sense, be bound by the global targets that we set? How are we going to get a climate change fund, which, as John said this morning, was supposed to be 100 billion and could be 100 billion, but is actually only at the moment 5 billion of commitments made to the poorer countries of the world? Can we have a better system of decision making? And so you look at the different organizations in the world, and could we make them more effective? Could the IMF and World Bank do more to promote climate change? And certainly the World Bank has announced that 28% of its commitments would be for climate change investments. It's achieved only 19%, but it's one of the biggest commitments it's made. But the problem with the World Bank and the IMF, as I see it, is that they will not command the confidence of the island states, of the poorer economies, of people who've got the problem of desertification and the problems of drought and everything else, the economies that are not the big economies in the world, but the small economies. Because if you look at the structure of governance in the World Bank and the IMF, more than 50% of the shares are held by only 10 countries, and these 10 countries are responsible for 70% of current emissions and 80% of historic emissions. Now, it's right that they should take greater action than other people, but of course you cannot have confidence if you're a small island state, if you're excluded from the decision-making process, which is essentially dominated by these 10 countries. And of course, America has a veto at the IMF at 15% or 16% of the shares. Then you look at the G20. Now, is it a possible vehicle for making progress? That's the G20, bringing together all the governments of the world. We did it in 2009 during the financial recession. China opposed at that time. We wanted to discuss the environment, but China opposed discussing it. Would they now agree to do so? But here again, you have a problem, because the G20 countries actually add up to 75% of emissions and 85% of historic emissions. And so the countries that are most in need of help because of the danger that their emissions will rise feel totally excluded from that process altogether. So 170 countries, and yes, the G20 could do a lot of things to admit that they have responsibilities that they've got to meet, but for that to be the process of decision-making, you would have to have the confidence of the 170 other countries in the world system who are not represented at the G20 at all. So it does come back to the United Nations. Not the United Nations Security Council, because if you think of the 5 that have got a veto, they're responsible for about 40% of the emissions and about 75% of the historic emissions, and they could just veto anything. So it has to go through a different process, and that's why the work of Commissioner Alba as the ambassador is so important. Can you therefore improve the way we make these environmental decisions so that countries will feel bound to honour them? Yes, I think in the UN Environmental Programme, and yes, in the UN Environment Assembly, which are institutions that have grown in status and stature over recent years, they will deal with biodiversity, they'll deal with oceans, they'll deal with some of the other problems of soil fertility and everything else, very important problems where we haven't made as much progress as we want to do, but they will need some more teeth to be able to be effective. And when it comes to the UN climate change framework, the Convention on Climate Change, again, we have to have a stronger decision-making process that makes people feel bound by the results. So yes, we've got to do all the other things, but we're going to have to improve the international system. And I come back in the end to where John Kerry talked this morning, that it is popular protest and popular concern expressed in all the different countries of the world that will make a difference. So yes, it's important you have a national campaign in the United States of America, but it's also important in all the other countries of the world where there are either climate change problems or historic emissions that have made them responsible for a lot of the problems that we have. There's got to be more popular mobilization. But the case for cooperation has got to be made. I'll just give you one example in concluding. The international space race dominated our thoughts from the 1950s to the 1980s. And America won the race to get to the moon, and Russia spent a huge amount of money originally getting Yuri Gagarin up in space and everything else. And it was a fight to the finish between these two countries. It reflected the Cold War, and it was bitter, and it was acrimonious. Yet somehow, in the 1980s, everyone came to the conclusion that the space race should be replaced by an international space station. And now 20 countries have sent their astronauts up into the International Space Station. Indeed, America cannot launch these space ships on its own these days because of the changes in technology and everything else, relies on Russia, and Russia could not run an international space station on its own because American technology is superior. So we are totally dependent on each other. Whatever the decisions that may be made in the future, this is an example of cooperation working, of interdependence being understood, of having to work together to get results that benefit all of us. And I say to you, if we can actually do all these things in the outer space, if we can actually cooperate in one of the most sensitive and one of the most acrimonious areas in international diplomacy, and do so for all these 30 years despite all the tensions on Earth, surely we can cooperate together to deal with this problem, both of climate change and the future of our environment. And I think today we should remember that while there is a debate in America about who's responsible, we must, in the end, bring all the countries of the world together to secure the results we want. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Gordon. I want to reintroduce the panel, and then I'm going to throw out a couple questions. Terry Tamminem is here. He is the CEO of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. He was also appointed by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger as Secretary of the California Environmental Protection Agency, and he was also later the Cabinet Secretary in the Schwarzenegger administration. Next to him is Professor Mario Molina, who was awarded the 1995 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his work in atmospheric chemistry, particularly concerning the formation and decomposition of the ozone. He also won the Tyler Prize, the Environmental Tyler Prize, that is awarded here at USC, and we are very proud of that particular prize. So basically we have the NGO community, and we, in a certain sense, in government, and we have the science community. And Ambassador Alba, Gordon's already mentioned him, was appointed by the Secretary General just recently as a special envoy for the 2019 Climate Action Summit. And this summit will focus on building momentum for enhancing national ambition and accelerating the implementation of climate action and the Paris Agreement. So I'd like to begin the question with the ambassador in terms of how he sees the agenda for 2019 coming from the UN perspective and the Paris Agreement perspective.
Well, thank you very much. After listening to Prime Minister Brown, it's going to be much easier to reply because I think the Secretary General listened to you quite carefully. First of all, let me tell you that the meeting obviously has the objective of increasing ambition. It's quite dramatic what we are confronting, and even if you take all the commitments that have been made in Paris, we will still be at least 1/3 of what is needed to attain the level of ambition that the IPCC latest report on 1.5 degrees asked us to do in the last 11, 12 years. So ambition is the center. But the Secretary General has understood, first of all, that we cannot just sound the alarm. We need to show the way forward. And in that sense, he has recognized first the need to involve different stakeholders. This is not going to be a summit for leaders of the governments. It is not going to be a meeting for speeches. The Secretary General has been very clear in asking leaders to come with a plan with concrete actions that can be implemented with a time frame to do that. But he's addressing leaders in general. He's not addressing national governments. He's also referring to the invitations that are being sent to local governments, to the business sector, to civil society in general. So the first point is to recognize that we need the participation of different stakeholders to achieve the goals that we have. If you compare just briefly what the situation was 10 years ago, there are many people, particularly in the business sector, which is already pushing governments to do more. It was not the case 10 years ago because of innovation, because of a number of opportunities to do business, and we need to take stock of that and use it to raise ambition. The second element for the summit is that if it's going to be an action-oriented meeting, the Secretary General is committing not only to do a follow-up of those actions that will be presented at the summit. In that sense, the summit will not end on the 23rd, but it will be the beginning of a process that intends to foster action in the framework of the institutional architecture that we have already built. So we will be moving ahead a little bit of the schedule that was agreed in Paris, because the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, supposed to be updated by 2020. But we are asking all participants to come in 2019 with a plan to start that process, and not only to set up the goals for 2020, but more importantly, to have a plan at least for 2030, which is the critical time that the IPCC report gave us. And we will be doing the follow-up immediately after, taking action by action, and making sure that the system responds. And in that sense, it's very much coincidental with what Prime Minister was mentioning. We have a system within the United Nations composed by different institutions, but we also have a special relationship with the IMF, with the World Bank, with other institutions, private institutions, regional institutions that need to be involved into this process, because we have been working kind of in silos, and we have not taken full advantage. But the main reflection that we have is that the time of negotiations has ended. It has been a painful road, even before Copenhagen. And by the way, I was the special envoy of Mexico for Cancun, and we were able to rescue quite a lot of the agreements that were reached in Copenhagen, and it was possible later to build up to Paris. But the point is that negotiations are almost finished. If you look into the latest news coming from the last COP in Katowice, we were able to have already what is called the rule book, the rules that will govern the Paris Agreement. We have only one pending issue, which is a delicate one, but it's a minor, which refers to markets. It's a so-called Article 6. Most of the negotiations have already been done. And it has been a successful process. We need to recognize that it has been successful. It has not set up strict goals for each country, as it could have been the case. But it has built a process on which it would be quite clear for a country not delivering what they have promised to be singled out and to be pressured by its peers. So it's a system that works only by having some champions, moving the agenda forward, and making sure that those champions understand not only the gravity of the situation, the moral and the political imperatives, but also the opportunities, because there are opportunities in the transformation that the economy will need. So we need those countries to lead. The last point that I would make is that if the system has focused on negotiations and is no longer necessary. Now the system as a whole needs to move into implementation. And if we are able to identify opportunities and needs, that will apply to all countries, developed and developing. I will come back probably later on one point which is very important, which is to keep the pressure on the major emitters. We cannot forget on all this process, even though we work among 193 countries, that there are countries with special responsibilities, and the Secretary General will address that, particularly in the context of the G20.
Professor Molina, maybe you could talk a little bit about the role of the science community, in terms of the upcoming 2019 talks, but also in the past talks. If you could talk about the role of sciences, the sciences and the scientists in particular in the process.
Yes, let me start with that, then I want to make a comment
Sure.
on the international agreements. But first, my general impression is that the scientific community has really done a very poor job of communicating this problem to the public, because scientists normally have their own language, they talk to each other, sometimes they use words like error, which for us is something in a Gaussian that you explain how things are distributed, but for people in general, if you are making errors, that means you're wrong and you have to do something else. So that's just an example of using the wrong language. But also scientists in general have not been very eager to sort of change their usual job, just to keep doing research and to really consider this as a public responsibility. But that's changing. Many of us now feel that we do have this responsibility of first learning how to communicate, but then doing it together. We need to do a much better job. And in particular, we want to explain that climate is a complex system. Hence, we're not certain what's going to happen, say, towards the end of the century. That depends, of course, on what society does. But let's assume that we don't do very much. That I would call that President Trump's scenario. Okay. If we assume that, we're not sure what will happen, but we talk about risk. There is a very large risk that the temperature will go above 2 or 3 degrees. But there is, and this is a big worry, there is something more than a 1 in 5 risk. Just a 20% risk doesn't sound huge, but that's a risk that the temperature will go up more than 5 degrees towards the end of the century. And that would be absolutely disastrous for society, because there would be places on the planet that would be uninhabitable, huge migrations, the economy would burst, all sorts of things. So risking a 5-degree change is totally irresponsible. It's not that science tells us what to do. This is a matter of ethics, of social responsibility, okay? So we consider it enormously irresponsible not to act in view of having such an enormous risk. Just think of climbing in an airplane and the pilot telling you, we have a technical problem. Don't worry. Well, we know you are in a rush, so we won't spend time fixing it. There's only a 1 in 5 chance that we won't make it. But let me make a second point very briefly, which is it has to do with international experience. And it's adding one more example to what Prime Minister Brown mentioned. And that is society has done it once already. We have very few, but we have some very important global problems. What's a global problem in terms of the atmosphere and so on? A main characteristic, it doesn't matter where you emit the gases that are changing the composition of the atmosphere, because it gets mixed all over. So that's a problem with climate. We have to work together. But that was a problem with the ozone layer. And it was possible, we had to work very hard, but in particular the private sector, who at the beginning was very much opposed, then they really worked with us very closely together. And I think that can happen again. Of course, it was much simpler because there were only 5 or 6 very large chemical industries, but they agreed to solve the problem. And the problem of keeping the ozone layer safe, which is essential for our survival and so on. That problem was solved through the Montreal Protocol. More than 170 nations, they agreed they would completely stop the production of these chemicals that have the potential to damage the ozone layer. And it's now recovering. So it can be done. We've done it. Let's do it once more.
Terry, I don't want to make you the spokesperson for all of the global civil society.
Sure,
or
why not? He's speaking for all science, and why not?
But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experience with the foundation in terms of the COP process, the Paris Agreement, et cetera, and share your visions.
First of all, I want to thank everybody for participating in this panel and all of you for being here. A lot of friends, a lot of new faces. It's great to know that we're all in this together. But I do want to start by complimenting Prime Minister Brown. He may not remember, but on his first day as Prime Minister was also Tony Blair's last day, and I was Cabinet Secretary to Schwarzenegger, and we came to number 10 Downing Street to have a roundtable with business leaders who were showing that measuring their carbon footprint and reducing it was good for business. And we needed to bring those stories to California in the early days of AB 32, our Global Warming Solutions Act. And so we did a press conference with Prime Minister Blair and so forth, and then we went to meet with Gordon, and he started talking about climate change, and it's so great to see him continuing to do this and having this as being such an important issue. And we walked out of that meeting, and Arnold turns to me and he says, "He's fantastic." And you have continued to be fantastic, so give him a great big round of applause. You know, there's a tourist website in Australia where they take questions about Australia, and a guy from America asks this website, this is a true story, what direction is north in Australia? And so the website manager, he answers back, he says, well, when you get here, face south and turn 180 degrees, and then call us for the rest of the directions. Now, I mention this because while it's funny, it exemplifies the answer to your question, which is, too many people don't understand the way the world works today. And even in these big global initiatives to try to get this right, we are all talking from a completely different set of sheet music, or singing from different sheet music. And so the DiCaprio Foundation a couple of years ago looked at the Paris Agreement, which we all know those voluntary commitments, if reached, would not be enough to keep us below 2 degrees centigrade temperature change, probably be more like 3.5. And so they're not enough, and they're voluntary. We don't know if they're all going to get done. And so that was the first problem. The second problem we recognized back then was that we cannot have a target of 2 degrees centigrade rise. And more recently, just late last year, the IPCC came out and made that point better than we could. The difference between a 1.5 degree and a 2 degree temperature rise is catastrophic, both economically and environmentally, and may put solutions out of our grasp in the future. So we said, well, let's take a look at the various climate models, the science that has been developed and that says, here's how you could get to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees in some reasonable way. And 97 out of the 100 really generally accepted climate models at that point were aimed at 2 degrees, not 1.5. And a significant percentage of their solution set included BECCS, which is an abbreviation for biomass energy with carbon capture and sequestration. So that means it could be burning coal, but then getting the CO2 from the smokestack and sequestering it somehow. It could mean burning woody biomass or other waste biomass materials, but then growing more trees to absorb more carbon than what you just released from burning that material. The problem with that, of course, is that you're going to grow those trees in the future and the emissions are happening today. We cannot afford that short-term addition to our problem while there's a long-term solution that may or may not work. And of course, carbon capture and sequestration from smokestacks, it's been demonstrated, but it's too expensive without at least $100 a ton price on carbon and doesn't work everywhere. So we said, we challenged 26 academic institutions and we funded what we now call the One Earth Climate Model that you can Google. It's now available as a 550-page book by Springer Nature. It's a great doorstop if you want to buy the book, but you can download it for free. And what we challenged these institutions to do was to give us a climate model that would stop warming at 1.5 and that did not rely on things which were frankly impractical or unlikely to happen, even if the solutions they offered were ambitious. The good news is this peer-reviewed scientific paper came back and it said, yes, we can in fact stop warming before 1.5 if we do 3 things by 2050. With some important milestones along the way. Number one, we have to get most of the world's energy supply to be renewable, clean energy. And even a couple years ago when we started on this journey, that might have seemed politically and technologically a challenge. But in that time, the 5th largest economy in the world, which you're sitting in today, the state of California, has committed to be 100% renewable powered by 2045. And big companies like Walmart have committed to doing so as well. So it's not a crazy idea. Second thing was that we have to move most of the world's large-scale agriculture back to what our grandparents did, regenerative agriculture, using the soil instead of sterilizing and killing it and then supplementing it with petrochemical fertilizers. Interesting that those fertilizers come from the same companies that deny climate change and got us into this mess. And again, you'd say, well, that's going to be impossible, especially in the US, to turn around big agribusiness. But the US Department of Agriculture has been working in large-scale demonstration projects with farmers in the Midwest and here in California. And the farmers themselves are finding higher yields at lower cost by going back to regenerative agriculture. And they are now becoming the missionaries for this concept. And the third thing is we have to save about half the planet for nature. And that's not just for birds and bees and biology. It's for the ecosystem services that nature provides to humans, including clean air and clean water and so forth. And again, that might seem impossible, but we're working with modern technology, Google and other mapping institutions, and this is again where philanthropy steps in and can do some of this, to fund the mapping of what have we preserved already with marine protected areas, with wilderness areas, et cetera. What more do we need to actually make that a safety net for the planet that can sustain 10 billion people and a diverse biodiverse world by 2050. And again, it's all very possible. Ambitious, yes, but possible. So our goal is to try to get more countries, companies, academics, others to embrace this model so that we're finally all singing from the same sheet music, because then there's a chance at the harmony that the other speakers have said we're going to need to address this before it's too late.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. We talk a lot about sustainable development at the global level, and a lot of the Western aid programs, et cetera, have emphasized that. And most Western aid programs have conditionalities dealing with human rights and the environment. But one of the largest development programs that the world has been offered is the Chinese Belt and Road Project, which has no conditionalities or few conditionalities and that sort of stuff. How should we react to that? How do we convince the Chinese government is going to spend billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, on development projects throughout the world? How do we convince them to adopt a more sustainable development strategy? And this is open for anyone that would like. I know the ambassador probably won't want to say anything on that one, but you're welcome to.
Why not?
Yeah, sure.
No, let me tell you, because I was in China only a couple of weeks ago. And I may be going back at the end of this month precisely to talk about the Belt and the Road Initiative and the implication of greening the Belt and the Road. Seriously doing that. They are investing in about 100 coal plants, and they have opened a discussion to stop that process. I think there is an opportunity to have a fundamental change. That would be one of the major announcements that could be expected at the summit in September. Hopefully, but I think they need partners, and they need the European Union to step up and partner, and they need India to follow, and other major emitters of the G20. That's why we need to have a comprehensive strategy. But I think the Chinese authorities have realized the opportunities. It's as simple as that. It could be a very good business. Today, solar is much cheaper than coal, and they are exporting that everywhere. They are also building something which is impressive, which is the potential connection of all the grills they could start by region, but it could also be transatlantic or trans-Pacific. And that will solve the problem of storage of electricity. So they have very ambitious plans.
Oh, yeah. Okay. No, what I wanted to add about China, which it's remarkable, the contrast with what's happening within China. And that is that climate change, fortunately, has been able to be coupled with air quality. Mm-hmm. So that's why the Chinese got convinced they're no longer building one coal-fired power plant every week. And so just building some, but not nearly as many. But that the population is responding. Population wants to have cleaner air and so on. So I think that's a very important component, particularly for the developing world, in India as well. So again, it pays off. Yeah. So why not do it? You just have to convince them to work for both goals at the same time.
The economy is growing.
Right.
At the same time.
I was actually in China for the Olympics, and then I've been back many times since. The Olympics, they closed all the factories around Beijing for the period of the Olympics. And then for a time they were saying only half the cars by license plate number could use the roads one day, and the other half could only use them the other day. And so half the cars were banned from the roads. They now, as you say, have 60% of the world's solar power market. I think they are cutting back on their own coal power stations, but they are building coal power stations for the Vietnamese and the Pakistan and so on.
Exactly.
So they're exporting some of their potential emissions to other countries, and that is something of a problem. On the Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, you've got to look, I think, at the Asian Infrastructure Bank. So the Asian Infrastructure Bank was created as an Asian investment bank to invest in new infrastructure. Now, America refused to join when invited by the Chinese to join the Asian Bank, thinking it was intended as an alternative to the World Bank. Japan refused to join. But our country, Britain, and all the European countries decided to join, despite the note coming round from the American Treasury. And we feel saying not to join. And we felt at the time, and Britain feels, that if America had joined, they could have imposed and helped us impose higher standards on the infrastructure bank. So it would have to take into account environmental standards. It would have to take into account social standards, labor standards as well. And I think we lost the chance to say to the Chinese, yes, yeah, it's right, we need to invest more in infrastructure, but you need to have as high standards as other banks, like the World Bank moving out of coal and everything else. And we lost that chance, I think. Now, it is still possible for that to be resuscitated. And I'm told that the initial experience of the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which is part of the work on the Silk Road, is that they are more accountable than people expected them to be. They are trying to be more representative and bring other people into the administration. And they are aware that they've got to meet environmental goals. So there is an opportunity here. And just as John Kerry said, the last climate change agreement was only possible because he could get the Chinese on board. So the next set of climate change agreements will inevitably require China. And you will have many visits to China in the next few months to try and get them on board.
Most likely.
Right. Thank you. In his recent book, David Wallace Wells, the book is called The Uninhabitable Earth. And he argues that fear and panic and catastrophic thinking may be the only way for us to see the real threat and then to act. We've heard a lot today about incremental policies and incrementalism. And is the time past for that kind of incrementalism? I know it's past for the postponers who want to till we have the next technology, but do we need to follow his suggestion that this is a real threat and we have to start thinking in terms of fear and panic and catastrophic thinking?
I would definitely say yes, obviously with some caveats to a certain amount of practicality, but I think, you know, as Prime Minister Brown said in his opening remarks, that one of the good things we're seeing now is a public that is starting to get more engaged. You have school students that are striking in front of their parliaments and in every other possible way to draw attention to this. Greta Thunberg, who started all of this in Sweden, had one of the best quotes I think I've heard all year, which is that, you know, she hears from older people, and I have to admit I'm guilty of saying this sort of thing too, of saying, you know, I'm so grateful, you younger generation, so grateful that you're going to fix the problem that my generation and my parents' generations created. And she said, yes, but we could use a little of your help along the way. And so we've got some very, very smart, very passionate, very committed people that I think are starting to force change. And in this country, I think that's going to turn into votes. I think people are going to now start to take this existential threat, but also recognizing that it's an economic opportunity. It's the way you invent the future. Instead of being wedded to a past of horses and buggies and coal-fired power plants that's going to leave us behind economically. I think more and more people are aware. And certainly, you know, again, Great Britain leads the way. I don't know how many of you saw in the paper the other day that in Parliament, while they were debating that little thing called Brexit, a bunch of climate campaigners got up in the gallery and stood up there naked to draw attention to the problem of climate change. So actually, Prime Minister, since you raised that issue of having more public engagement, are you prepared to take similar bold action?
Yeah, if I can add a comment, because this is sort of complementary to what I stated earlier about the possibility of a real catastrophe. Scientists have been worried about being perceived as too pessimistic, and so that's one of the reasons they normally don't like to go to those extremes. But my opinion is, yes, it might be necessary to talk about the existential threat and the possibilities of disasters, as long as you really couple that. You have to couple that to the fact that we can solve it. Let's be optimistic. Let's work together. We can do it. If you merely talk about catastrophes, that's not going to be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a great story told about Alfred Nobel, who was the founder of the Nobel Prize that you rightly won. And he was on holiday in France, and he picked up a newspaper, and the newspaper had his obituary. And his obituary was that he was an arms dealer, he was a weapons manufacturer, he had done nothing to contribute to the peace of the world. And immediately he transformed his behavior, and he set up the Nobel Prize, and he did all these charitable and philanthropic things afterwards. He realized that his legacy was actually negative when he wanted it to be something that was positive. And I think when people are assaulted with the facts about what's happening, then I think you will see a change. And you talked about the scientific community not getting the message across. And I think we have to have a more concerted effort to get that message across. And certainly, I'm not one who says that incremental change will make the difference. I'm trying to look for a way in which we can get the global system to work more effectively. And I think it will be a transition from nationally determined commitments to nationally determined commitments that are greater within 1.5 to eventually, I think people will have to agree, and you have to get many countries on board, that they will have to agree their commitments within 1.5 at an international gathering. And I think we're on a transition to that, because once, of course, countries were bound in by commitments that they had to meet, then there's no way out for them. And I think that is where the process is going to have to go in the future. So there will be, I think, a more dramatic change in the way that we do these things in the next few years.
Ambassador Alba?
If I may add, I fully agree, but if I may add a comment, there are a number of countries that still think that climate policy is an option, that it's not a central element in their own policies. And they deal with the issue whenever there is prosperity or space, and they reduce action. And that's a fundamental change we need to achieve. All governments, and that's the merit of a summit, need to understand that climate has to be at the center of their policies, their development, their economic policies, and many transformational changes that are needed to be in line with the Paris goal and the 1.5 will require the participation of many actors. It's not just the decision of the national governments, which is required. You need in some cases you need new legislation, incentive, rules that will govern the way we produce, the way we consume, and eventually the price of carbon, which needs to be increased dramatically if we want to achieve the 1.5 degree. But it is achievable. The report of the IPCC shows the way. We just need to reduce by 45% the emissions before 2030. and we need to go to the net zero emission by 2050. It is possible to achieve that.
How do we achieve that, though, with the gap between the rich and the poor states, and the global South, and their efforts to develop? I know we have to show them the way to develop, not the way we did, but what are the agencies, what are the global institutions that can lead that? When you consider that Donald Trump is going to name the next head of the World Bank, and when you consider essentially the belief system or the orientation of the Trump administration, is the World Bank going to take a lead in terms of its loan processes and its programs, or is the UN going to play that role?
Well, the World Bank has committed recently to 200 billion to be expended on climate during the next 5 years. And if you look at what a huge impact that may have in a number of countries, then you have reasons to be optimistic. I was also in Africa, and the point is very clear. Countries need to be certain that they can fight poverty and climate at the same time. It is possible, it has been demonstrated, but we need to scale up the action. I visited some of the plants in Morocco or Egypt, which are very, very, very huge in terms of solar plants, and they're proving the benefits of getting cheaper and cleaner energy. But we also need to make the point that there are going to be some sectors that may be affected negatively, and we will also need to have a strategy to compensate that. What we call the just transition is something which is real. We need to retrain workers. We need to make sure that the new opportunities, new job creation would be integral part of this process, because we need the support of the population. We cannot afford that some would be the winners and others would be the losers in this question. So getting the governments with a comprehensive social policy and making sure that all the benefits, especially on health, are very well perceived. Not repeating the mistakes that the developed countries have done. It's quite easy to say, but you have to provide the means. Let me go back a little bit just with the question of the money. Prime Minister Gordon Brown and State Secretary Kerry mentioned this morning the number of 5 billion compared to the 100 billion that were promised. That's not necessarily accurate. 5 million is what has been channeled through the Green Fund. But we are in the process of producing a study precisely for the summit to see where developed countries are in the commitment of transferring 100 billion by year to the developed countries. And I can tell you that the numbers today goes between 47, the lowest, to almost $80 billion. So we are not so bad. We still, obviously, to do better. But it's not only through the Green Climate Fund.
Okay. I can make a quick comment first. That was one of the important precedents of the Montreal Protocol. I remember it was a big discussion whether the United States would actually come up with money to help developing countries, because would that hurt the economy? It turns out that it worked extremely well, and the economic cost was negligible. Okay. Now, for climate change, it's more. But it is very important because that's one way to really entice the developing countries to work and so on. But we have to learn, because there have already been some carbon bonds and so on that have been managed indirectly by United Nations and so on, but with too much bureaucracy and too much interest and so on. So the process of distributing these resources is critical. That needs to be re-examined to make sure it really works sufficiently. Yeah.
One quick comment on this as well. You know, we've seen the disasters, climate disasters playing out all around the world, and most recently in southeastern Africa. And yesterday, the United States committed $400 million, assuming certain political changes occur, for Venezuela, for rebuilding Venezuela. But only $4 million for the 3 countries that have been devastated and are still living with an inland ocean that was created by unprecedented storms. And that only came out of the USAID budget. It wasn't even an actual allocation. So until we start showing in the developed world that we actually care about these countries, this comes back to what Mayor Garcetti said. You can fix the potholes, but who's going to care if the roads are underwater? So yes, we do have to do the things that we're talking about here and help them with clean development, but we're going to have to take care of the adaptation that is necessary for many of these countries for whom climate change is already too late.
I think we've got to recognize that these countries are going to emit more unless we do something dramatic about it, because the rise of the global middle class is not going to happen in America or in Europe. It's going to happen in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. And the general view is that once you move from being in poverty to being in that global middle class, then you are responsible for twice as big a carbon footprint as someone who is poor. And it's obviously understandable: cars, airline travel, everything else. And so the global middle class is rising from only 1 billion in 1990 to about 3 billion, more than 3 billion now, to rise to 5 billion by 2030. So the carbon footprint in these countries that previously had very small middle classes is going to grow. So their prosperity, or greater prosperity, is going to cause this unless we do something about it. So can you use the aid budgets? Well, we set a target many years ago of 0.7% of GDP for aid. We in Britain managed to get there. The Scandinavian countries have got there. Luxembourg has got there. America's only at 0.2%, whereas 0.7 was the target. Canada's about 0.2%. On average, we're raising 150 billion a year in aid, but we should be raising 600 billion to meet the need. Now, can you redirect more of an increased aid budget to environmental purposes? Yes, in my view. Can you get corporates involved in delivering green bonds through the World Bank and through other institutions working with them? Yes, you can. Corporate philanthropy is 500 billion, more than ever is going to environmental purposes. So there is scope to do more. But again, what's happened is aid is relatively unpopular, where actually most of the aid is going to very good causes and spent as efficiently and cost effectively as possible, and it would be better if it was spent multilaterally rather than bilaterally with people acting together. But again, this comes back to popular pressure. You know, in Britain, and I think in Europe as a whole, and probably here too, I mean, in the last year, I've been amazed by the number of young people that have taken up the cause of plastics in the oceans. And as John Kerry said this morning, there'll soon be more plastic than there is fish in oceans. And I think that taking up that cause shows that if you can present an argument well, if you can show the implications and what is likely to happen in the future, then in particular young people can be motivated to take action. And I think we should be thinking of how we can persuade people of the facts that you have, and then say we can use aid budgets, but we can also encourage companies to get into this business. So there is a tremendous amount we can do, but it actually seems to me to depend more on popular pressure starting this off than on governments just reacting or just doing it on their own say-so. We need a more informed public to be able to put pressure on all the international as well as national authorities.
I'm going to open it up to questions now, so raise your hand and somebody with a mic will come to you. It won't work, so just be ready to
Shout.
Is there there's a mic, yeah.
A methodology for us to change our water containment bottles from plastic to another kind of material. Everybody's walking around with plastic bottles.
Yeah. Jerry's not.
This is for the professor.
That's why I asked. That's why I asked for this. There's a.
How do we do that? Not only for our country, but for other countries that have to carry water from a well to another location.
Well, in a lot of countries, they don't use plastic, but there's a new company called Loop, which actually just debuted at the World Economic Forum. I don't know, the mic's not working. I'll just speak a little louder. There's a company that just debuted at the World Economic Forum called Loop, which is trying to end the use of single-use containers and create a closed-loop system where people would get everything from laundry detergent to water in reusable containers that actually go back to the company, like in the old days. Those of us that are old enough to remember Coke bottles that we would return and they'd get cleaned and we'd get another Coca-Cola in that. And there's a great economic case to be made for that, and I think that's because of this pressure, this public pressure around plastics, and it's actually not that cheap to use plastic anymore. So I do think there are technical solutions that are being offered, but a lot of it is public awareness. I mean, we come up here today and I saw plastic water bottles, but I also saw this in the back of the room. I'm not going to waste one more piece of plastic. It's a mindfulness thing.
But I'm in the healthcare business, hair care, skincare. We tried to initiate a program where we would have returnable bottles for your shampoos and conditioners. People did not do it.
No.
And,
Yeah.
thank you. And to make them so that they had no bacteria in them after they've been used the first time required a lot of other chemicals. So it's a good sword and a bad sword, double-edged sword.
Well, we have a solution
Yeah,
for a Nobel
briefly.
Prize winner.
Yeah, first, that's a problem that is different from climate change. It's a very important one, but that's why I don't want to spend a lot of time with it. But there are lots of potential technical solutions. Among them, there are new biodegradable bottles that won't last for 100 years in the ocean, but just half a year or whatever. There are technical problems because you don't want it to biodegrade in the store, okay? So, but there are many things in the works for that particular issue, but that's just one example of a different problem, and we have to look, after all, at climate change also as perhaps the largest worry that we have in terms of environmental issues. But scientists together have put some papers in which they talk about planetary boundaries, and there are 19 that are very well identified. One of them has to do with the oceans, but the biggest worry is climate change. That's number one there. A second one was stratospheric ozone. That's the one that has been solved. Okay, but the other 19 are still very worrisome, nitrogen cycle and so on. So we have lots of things to do, and of course we want to coordinate as much as possible.
I have a question on the international, as it dovetails with Washington. I mean, since I've been covering this, since the election, I feel like the international community on climate has sort of treated the Trump presidency as an aberration, and well, yes, 4 years are going to be lost, but states and subnational governments are doing all of this work, and hopefully things will get back to normal in 2020. And I'm hoping, Mr. Prime Minister and Mr. Investor, if you could give us some insight into what is the thinking, is there any thinking on a plan B? I mean, what if President Trump wins a second term, pulls out of the Paris Agreement as he has said he would, and another 4 years are lost in the United States? What's being discussed in the international community? Is there any discussion about how to strategize about this and how to work on things or work around the U.S.?
Thank you very much.
He's a diplomat.
Well, let me start by telling you that we are engaging with all member states of the UN, including the federal government of the United States of America, and we are having a conversation on a number of issues. So I think that's important to recognize. Let me also tell you that the international context is quite different. When we were in Copenhagen and still in Cancun and probably to some extent in Paris, people was waiting for the other to move, for them to move. We were all assuming that if the neighbor on our side or a competitor didn't move, the other will not move. And this is no longer the case, and that's a very positive message. I think it is quite obvious that the global leadership political will today is not as high as it was at the time we went to Paris. Nonetheless, I have not heard one single government telling me that they will do or not, depending on what others does. And that is very positive. And that's why through the summit, we want to recognize those countries that are willing to move. And the trouble that we are seeing in different countries does not limit to one country, unfortunately. I think there are different countries in different regions which are lagging behind to what they committed in Paris, and we will put equal pressure on all of them.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's a tendency if one country looks as if it's a free rider and not taking action, others will say, what's the point in us taking action? And there's obviously also, you know, people do blame America for certain things. I remember during the financial crisis, I went to see President Lula when he was in power in Brazil. And he told me this story. He said, look, when I was a trade union leader and people said, what's wrong with the country? He said, the government's to blame. And then he said, when he was the leader of the opposition, and he was asked, what's wrong with the country, Brazil? He said, the government's to blame. And then he said, I became the government. And people asked me, who's to blame? And I said, America. And so there's a tendency for that to happen. But I actually think the ambassador is right. Countries are filling this vacuum in international leadership. You know, I was at Davos when the president of China came to Davos to present himself as the leader on free trade and on a whole series of other issues, including peace, but also on the environment. Now, given where we were 10 years ago at Copenhagen, this is a complete volte-face. So China is wanting to say it's filling the vacuum. You go to Europe, and the European leadership have always felt that they were ahead of America on these issues of the environment. And Angela Merkel is one, and of course President Holland was involved in the Paris Agreement. So all these European countries, with the exception perhaps of some of the Eastern European countries, are actually wanting to take a lead on these issues. So I think over these next 2 or 3 years, you'll see China and you'll see Europe trying to take a bigger leadership role. And I think the question is whether we can bind in the countries who are least developed and who feel still, I think, that they've been let down and that they're not getting the proper support to do what they're trying to do. But when there is a vacuum, other people tend to fill it. And I think that will be what happens.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you guys so much for being here. We really appreciate the time you took. So my question is, when we talk about how the burden of climate change is falling disproportionately on the global south versus the global north, one of the problems we see is this rise in the number of climate migrants and refugees around the world, while simultaneously a lot of the foreign policies of many states are becoming increasingly isolationist or more security-centric. So my question is, do you think it's possible, and if so, how, can we use the international system to navigate global issues like this displacement? Thank you.
I'm going to play this role.
Well, let me start. I think it works.
It works.
Okay. Let me start by agreeing with you that the global south cannot be left alone, and the international community, and I think the multilateral system is built precisely to deal with this issue. The majority of developing countries do not want to be considered victims, but in fact they are not responsible of climate change, at least to a large extent, and therefore we have a responsibility. For some countries we are talking about the survival of those countries, if we talk about the Pacific or the Caribbean, and the UN can do something, and certainly one of the main objectives during the next summit would be precisely to better balance the agenda. We have focused too much on mitigation and not enough on adaptation and building resilience. So that would be one of the first steps. Through the Green Climate Fund, which it has only about 5 billion, but it's in a process of replenishment, and I hope a very successful one. At least we have already 2 countries who have committed to double their contributions, Germany and Norway. We will also pay attention, and we have a special fund also for adaptation. So I think the needs of the majority, at least referring to the least developed countries, I think the United Nations has the capacity to compensate the lack of support from the developed countries, if it happens. But many of developed countries continue to be active on that field. And I think it is a question of justice.
Yeah, well, you know, every week in a place called Agadez in Niger, people are congregating from all over that part of the continent to pay money to people traffickers to get to Europe. In part, it's because the agricultural economy that they depended on, desertification, soil fertility, there is not an income for them. And they work out that they would be better off poor in a rich country than being even rich in a poor country, and so they leave. And I think we're back to where we were discussing last year in this seminar on migration and what can be done. Surely the answer is we have got to help these African countries develop their economies in a sustainable way. And we pay a huge price in America and in Europe if there is so much illegal immigration and so much happening as a result of our failure to guarantee that people can at least have the chance of some prosperity in their own country. And I think it does reflect on the general balance of our policies towards development. You cannot expect a country with no tax base of any significance, where the poverty problem is enormous. And remember, 90% of the poverty of the world will be in Africa by 2030, 90%. It used to be 50%, it's going to be 90%, but you cannot expect them to move forward without some help from all of us. So solving the climate change problem is part of this. Solving the problem that forces migration is very much part of all this agenda, and I think it shows how the issues are all interrelated.
If I can add, I think there's one very important point to add, which is that we no longer have to look at solving climate change as a sacrifice economically. So the expectation is that technology will keep improving in such a way that you can certainly deal with it. You just have to do it in a very creative way, but it does not have to be an economic disadvantage. The challenge, of course, as you just mentioned, is to convince the developing world that they can leapfrog, and they can actually go into the newer technologies and get a very satisfying standard of living and so on, without hurting the climate. So that's very important to keep innovation and keep technology moving.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any question on that side? Yeah.
I suspect that that nuclear energy is not real popular in this room. However, I did want to see if you would comment, each of you, on how nuclear energy fits into this. I feel like it's the elephant in the room.
I probably need your microphone. Mine died. I'm happy to take a first stab at it. Oh, this one doesn't work. Oh, yeah, there we go. I don't think it's worth the risk. We've seen, obviously, many plants that have operated for decades safely, but when the catastrophes happen, they're absolutely unthinkable. And the other thing is, it's no longer a climate solution. You can't build enough nuclear power plants in the amount of time that it's going to take to shift our economy. You know, when we only have a couple of years to peak emissions and then, you know, cut them in half every decade, how long do you think it takes to design and permit and build a nuclear power plant? And then, of course, it's a lot cheaper to use renewable energy, even now with storage. When I was advising, at the time, candidate Obama, when he was running for president, he was asking about that because there was a lot of nuclear in his home state of Illinois. And there's a law which provides limits on liability for nuclear power plants in the United States. It's the only such law that exists for any industry. And I said to him, why don't you advocate, you know, if you think nuclear is a decent technology for both economic development and for climate change solutions, but by removing that law and removing that subsidy that would ultimately be a taxpayer subsidy, and then see how many get built.
Professor Molina.
Yeah, if I can, I make a little different, contrasting point, which is that this is a very good example of what I was talking about with innovation. So the new, the fourth or fifth generation nuclear plants, very small ones and much more secure, I think that's a possibility. I do agree that they're not here yet, but they're beginning to be deployed, and the United States is not the place to start because of all the regulations and so on. But that's certainly coming in the not too distant future. And if let me make one even more striking comment, and that's we're talking about fission here, but nuclear fusion that used to be 50 years in the future all the time, it's no longer that. It's probably now only a decade far because of the brand new magnets and so on. So I believe that's one good example of what technology needs to keep investing for innovation, because that's certainly a possibility. And of course, you have to make sure that it is very, very safe. Unfortunately, Fukushima was very bad luck because the plants that got destroyed were completely obsolete. Okay? So the brand new nuclear technologies can be very much safer. So it should be there as one of the options for the future.
Well, we're going to drop the mic on this panel, and thank you. Join me in thanking our panelists for.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.